Ukrainian defeat, or do you see a scenario where NATO will then move in, or NATO states like Poland that they will not accept Ukrainian defeat?
Well, if you look at the polls that are underway in Europe right now, particularly in Poland, the Polish electorate's opinion has changed dramatically over the last few months. At some point, they were more than 68% willing to directly engage in the war if necessary. Today, 56% of Poles who are voters in Poland have said, well, we'll continue to support the Ukrainians, but we will not under any circumstances intervene in Western Ukraine with Polish troops. I have a feeling that we're going to learn a great deal from that election, and this current government that has been prosecuting this war against Russia and Ukraine may find itself in a very fragile position. My point is, I think the European electorates have begun to say, we really don't want to go to war with Russia. So why are you going to war with Russia, whose approval rating at this point is about 31%? But I suspect on the current track, if the Germans continue on the current track with their government, he won't last. I think Mr. Macron is in a very weak position right now. I'm surprised he's still there. And that has to do with more than just the Russia issue, but with domestic problems. And I think the domestic problems in all the West European countries are going to grow worse as a result of the economy and the oil and gas problem, the energy problem. So my view is, I think the Europeans, if they elect the right people and put them in power, can end this thing. But Washington won't. No one in Washington is prepared to stand up and say, well, we were wrong. We misjudged Russia. Our underlying assumptions were wrong. Russia is not just a gas station with nuclear weapons. Russia is a rich and powerful state, rich in resources, has the best technology, has excellent weaponry, has good forces. Its population is firmly behind its government. And so they would rather let it drag on and drag on and drag on. And at some point, they'll change the subject here. That's what happened to us in Vietnam.
Yeah.
I mean, I lived through that. Suddenly we stopped talking about Vietnam and everybody said, what happened to Vietnam? I often ask people, what happened to the global caliphate? Now Russia's number one. Well, wait a minute now. Russia's not the big problem. It's really China. China, that's the problem. We have a bad habit of behaving this way. Remember, we're a maritime power historically, like the British. Mm-hmm. We sail into the place, we do things, and when things go badly for us, we sail home. Yeah. You live there. Remember what Charles de Gaulle said. The problem for Europe is Britain is an island and Americans don't live in Europe. That's still a huge problem. Mm-hmm. You need to wake up. That's the problem with all these alliance structures.
Yeah. I talked to Viktor Orban recently. I asked him, what is the main lesson you took from this war? And he said to me, well, the main lesson is that Europe doesn't exist. Europe has just vanished from the stage. We do not exist anymore. It's a terrible experience. What is the most important lesson you took out of this war so far?
Well, it's interesting that Orban made the comment he did because Gorshakov, who was the foreign minister for the Tsar at the time, sent a letter to, along with a document for his inspection to Chancellor Bismarck. Mm-hmm. And the note said, what happened to the concert of Europe? He was decrying the fact that all Europeans were not united and so forth. And Bismarck wrote in the margins, what is the concert of Europe? Right? Europe has never been Europe. Europe breaks down, and I grow so tired of this. I remember sitting in Vienna, listening to enthusiastic Austrians extolling the virtues of the euro, and the euro would be a big success, and Europe was going to be united on and on and on back in 1998, 1999. The view from Berlin is not the same as the view from Madrid. The view from Rome is different from the view in Berlin. The view from Stockholm is closer to Berlin's view. Mm-hmm. Now, the point is, I see Europe breaking down into different security zones. When I was at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, we once concluded that there was only one unifying force in the NATO alliance. That was almost universal dislike of France, because it was no longer an enemy in Russia. I mean, I think people are unrealistic in Europe to think that these things don't matter. Culture, religion, ethnicity, language, all of these things are meaningful. Mm-hmm. We have tried to paper it over. And unfortunately, many of you have tried to imitate us. And I think that's gotten you into a lot of trouble. You're Europeans. You are not the United States of Europe. You're not Americans. Mm-hmm. We, on the other hand, I think have not learned anything. We are beginning to have a groundswell of support in the electorate for what I would call non-intervention. People are beginning to say, well, wait a minute, why are we doing this? We intervened in Vietnam. That didn't work out well. We intervened all over the Middle East. The place is a disaster. Everywhere we go, we create conditions that are worse than the ones that we found. Countries that were formerly either disinterested in us or neutral have now become enemies. So why are we doing this? I think when we go through our financial crisis again, which I think is going to be much worse than 2008, you will see more and more of that in the United States. This business of interventionism is an unnatural thing for us. We are an empire from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We don't need anything else. Mm-hmm. And that was the view very early in our history. I think we're going to go back to that. Mm-hmm. But thus far, the government in Washington has learned nothing. Mm-hmm. But the clear strategic lesson is if you don't have to fight 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 miles from home, don't do it. I mean, that's common sense.
Common sense. Let's talk about ending the war, Colonel. There's a famous quotation, of course, everybody knows, but everybody forgets all the time. The famous quotation, war is the continuation of politics by other means, meaning that every war has a political root cause which has to be addressed when you want to end the war. So what is, according to you, political root cause of this war we have to keep in mind in order to end this war and to find a peace with stability?
Well, first, if you'll allow me just a modest correction. In German, Clausewitz wrote, mit anderen Mitteln.
Right.
We say by other means. It's the wrong translation. I is very different from with. Mm-hmm. So he said with other means. And he was right. War does continue with other means that's always there. Political conflict is always with us. Whether or not you opt for the military solution is another matter. We are not going to solve or resolve the conflict between ourselves and Russia quickly. We have lost a lot of trust, confidence, and credibility in Moscow. If you go back 30 years ago, in fact, I can go back to 2001 when I was in Moscow, I encountered no hostility to the United States at all. If anything, I encountered a great deal of relief that this insanity called the Cold War was over. And people that I spoke to very much looked forward, and these were senior officers in the Russian military establishment, very much looked forward to a better future. And if you recall, Solzhenitsyn said the war between East and West is over. The new war between North and South is just beginning. Now, I don't really want a war with the South either, but his point was right. This is artificially created by Washington and its vassal states in Europe. War with Russia. It's unnecessary. Russia presents no threat. Now, Russia today is far more powerful than it was in the 1980s. People are beginning to figure that out. And this Russian military establishment is much better than the Soviet armed forces that I personally saw. All the propaganda you're hearing about the Russians is wrong. Now, how do you end this? The number one thing that has to happen is to suspend aid to Ukraine. We are reluctant to do it. We're reluctant to do it for many reasons. One is it proves that we were wrong and we've lost. Secondly, we don't want to do it because there are a lot of people making a lot of money by shipping equipment into Eastern Europe and into Ukraine and essentially moving cash from the Pentagon into defense industries that also finds a home on the Hill. In other words, it's a money-making proposition, unfortunately, in Washington. But the number one thing is to suspend aid. Mm-hmm. A European power needs to stand up and do that. And I always thought, wrongly, obviously, that Berlin would finally step forward because Berlin has always been the one with the appreciation for what was real or not real in Russia. a much more sober-minded analysis was always to be found in Berlin. It's being destroyed. Berlin is now populated by people who are as deranged, in my view, and unclear about the real world as the people ruling us. But that's what has to happen. As soon as aid is suspended, it's effectively on the road to an end. Now, I think what Russia wants is a neutral Ukraine. I think what Russia wants is a Ukraine that is not hostile or an enemy of Russia, which is one of the reasons that he's held back the use of his military power. He may not be able to get everything he wants, but I think he could accept the neutrality, certainly on the Austrian model. That would work for him and work for the Russians. But again, that's something Europeans have to stand up and embrace and agree to negotiate. I just don't see Washington doing it. That our own financial position has become so weak that our economy, which is already in recession, though no one in Washington wants to admit it, and could be in far more serious trouble next year, may suddenly say, well, that's it. We can't focus anymore. We have other things to do, because at the end of the day, and this is what Europeans need to understand, there is nothing more important beyond our borders than what happens inside our borders. And if any American is asked to make a choice, do we control the border that Ukraine has with Russia, or do we control our own border? Everyone unanimously says we need to control our own borders. And most people are beginning to think we need to get the military, our own armed forces, back on our borders, which is where they were for over 100 years until 1948. I think we're headed that way. It will be left to Europeans to sit with the Russians. Then the question is, will the Russians listen? Depends on who shows up and what is said. We have never treated the Russian proposals seriously. We could have easily. We haven't. We didn't even consider them. Ab und zu mal habe ich den Eindruck, dass die Regierung in Berlin geistig abgetreten ist. I just don't get it. And I think, this is where people have to stand up and question their own government.
So you say people should go on the street and do it like in the Vietnam War and say, we've had it, that's enough, we want another direction.
Yeah, I think they have to go to the ballot box too. And I think they have to demand new leadership. And I think new leadership is there. Whether you like Wagenknecht or not, and she's obviously too far to the left for me, she's essentially right on foreign policy. If you listen to the leadership of the AfD, they are right on foreign policy. The German government has made so many terrible mistakes that have done such harm to the country, it's hard to begin to know where to start. And all of this is coming to what I think is a very dangerous situation. Not only do you have the problem with all of these unwanted so-called migrants, I mean, any country at some point is overwhelmed and sees its own culture, its own way of life, its laws at risk. The Germans are no exception. You add to that the destruction of the energy sector in Germany. I mean, why would you just suddenly halt all your nuclear reactors until you had a viable alternative? In other words, all these decisions were made in some sort of fantasy bubble instead of looking at what was realistic. Why would you want to deindustrialize Germany? First of all, I have not seen any of the classified information that would confirm or deny what Seymour Hersh wrote. I think Seymour Hersh is correct. I can't prove it, but I know him. He has a solid track record. And I think the German people should ask the question, why would our ally, the United States, be involved in such a terrible thing?